Well, welcome everybody. I'm Eric Potashnik, director of the Taubman Center for American Politics and Public Policy at the Watson School, and I am delighted today to moderate our panel on Professor Marion Orr's wonderful new book, House of Diggs, The Rise and Fall of America's Most Consequential Black Congressman, Charles C. Diggs, just published by University of North Carolina Press. Immediately after the event, Professor Orr will be signing copies of the book in the lobby. In a moment, I'll introduce today's distinguished panel, but let me first say a few words about the book. As a scholar of U.S. politics, I had certainly heard of Charles Diggs, but until reading the book, I confess I was largely unfamiliar with his life story or the scope of his impact on public policy and American society. When people think of leading Black members of Congress of the postwar era, a few names immediately leap to mind: Adam Clayton Powell Jr., Shirley Chisholm, John Conyers Jr., Barbara Jordan, Charles Rangel, and William H. Gray III, who served as majority whip when I was a lowly congressional staffer during the late 1980s, and is the only one of those leaders I had the privilege to watch up close. Professor Orr's book shows not only that Diggs has been overlooked, but that he deserves to rank at the top of this impressive list. Few, of any, leaders could match the breadth of Diggs's accomplishments. He was a driving force behind the establishment of the Congressional Black Caucus. He played a key role on many important issues, from D.C. Home Rule to desegregation of commercial air travel. The book draws on extensive archival work, and it uses Diggs's career as a vehicle to explore the larger story of Black political incorporation, and it offers many fresh insights into the civil rights movement, urban politics, and the opportunities and limits of coalition building in a pluralistic democracy. So Professor Orr is going to talk for about 15 minutes, and then each of the panelists will talk for 10, and then there'll be time for questions. So let me introduce the panelists. First, my colleague Marion Orr is the Frederick Lippitt Professor of Public Policy and Professor of Political Science and Urban Studies at Brown. He earned his BA degree in Political Science from Savannah State College, his MA Political Science from Atlanta University, now Clark Atlanta University, and his PhD in Government and Politics from the University of Maryland College Park. From 2008 to 2014, Professor Orr served as director of the Taubman Center. He is former chair of the Political Science Department and former director of Brown's Urban Studies program. He is the author and editor of many books, including Black Social Capital, The Politics of School Reform in Baltimore, 1986 to 1998. My colleague Catherine Tate is professor of political science at Brown University. Her PhD in political science is from the University of Michigan. She holds her bachelor's with honors from the University of Chicago. She's published 7 books, including the award-winning Black Faces in the Mirror and From Protest to Politics. Her most recent book is Gendered Pluralism from University of Michigan Press. And recently, she won the prestigious 2025 Haynes Walton Jr. Career Award from the American Political Science Association. This biennial award honors a political scientist whose lifetime of distinguished scholarship has made significant contributions to our understanding of racial and ethnic politics, and illuminates the conditions under which diversity and intergroup tolerance thrive in a democratic society. Dr. Elsie Scott is the founding director of the Ronald W. Walters Leadership and Public Policy Center at Howard University. Prior to that position, she served as president and CEO of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. She's enjoyed a distinguished career in local government, nonprofit, and academic settings. She's taught political science, urban studies, and criminal justice at several universities, including Rutgers, North Carolina Central, and Howard University. She received her BA from Southern University, MA from the University of Iowa, and her doctorate from Atlanta University, all in political science. And finally, Kate Clifford Lawson is a New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestselling author of 4 critically acclaimed biographies, including Walk With Me, a biography of Fannie Lou Hamer, and Bound for the Promised Land, Harriet Tubman, Portrait of an American Hero. After earning her BA and MA degrees from Simmons University and an MBA from Northeastern in Boston, she earned her doctorate in American history at the University of New Hampshire, specializing in 19th and 20th century U.S. women's and African American history. She's consulted on feature film scripts, including, I was quite excited to see this. Robert Redford's The Conspirator. That must have been pretty amazing. Yeah. Her award-winning consulting work includes Maryland's Harriet Tubman's Underground Railroad Station and National Historical Park. She's appeared on local, national, and international television, including the BBC and C-SPAN and CBS Sunday Morning. So welcome to the panel, and Marion.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Well, I am so thrilled and happy to be here and to see so many of you. Let me first of all thank Eric Potashnik and the Taubman Center for hosting this event. And let me thank my distinguished colleagues. I better put this closer. My distinguished colleague, Elsie and Catherine and Kate for joining me on this panel. Before I go any further, I want to give a shout out and a thank you to our former president, Ruth J. Simmons. President Simmons appointed me the inaugural Frederick Lippitt Professor of Public Policy, and had it not been for the resources of the Lippitt Endowment, I would not have been able to conduct all the research that Professor Potashnik laid out early on. So I thank President Simmons, and I want to thank the Lippitt family for their generous contribution to the university. I want to thank my wife, Ramona Burton, who's here. Ramona stuck by me throughout this whole process, 10 years. Well, actually, if you look at the first interview I did, it was 2014. So 11 years of writing and research, and she stuck with me and was very patient with me. That's why I dedicated the book to her and our daughter, Willia, who could not be here. Thank you, Ramona. And then finally, thank you again for all of you for being here. I'm so happy after 11 years of doing this. I've been waiting for this for a long time. The book came out last week, September 16th, by UNC Press. And I'm going to just go real quickly, but I want to hear from my colleagues. I'm going to tell you a bit about the process of putting the book together and a little bit about Congressman Diggs, who I believe was a really amazing and remarkable American leader. What was I saying? I have to stand up. Is this on here? Good. As Eric said, this book documents that when you array Diggs alongside many other Congress members, he ranks top in terms of legacy. His legacy is just tremendous and remarkable. And I argue in the book that when you look at the scope of his achievements and the lasting impact of his achievements, few members of Congress, I would say of any stripe, quite frankly, black, white, Republican, Democrat, top this guy's contribution. He would rank without question among the top members of the House. There have been about 12,000 members who've served in the House since the founding of Congress, and I would suggest to you that he would rank among the top in terms of accomplishment. Clearly the most consequential black member of Congress. And there have been, I think, 300 or so black members of Congress over the course of history. Congratulations, Catherine, on being named the Haynes Walton Jr. Career Awardee for the American Political Science Association. I was the 2019 awardee of the Haynes Walton Award. Congratulations to you, well-deserved, distinguished colleague and political scientist. Give me a second. This guy taught me at Savannah State College when I was 17, 18 years old. And that's how I learned about Charlie Diggs, through Haynes Walton. A political scientist. He died in 2013. Feel like this yesterday to me. He started his career at Savannah State, where, as Eric said, I did my undergraduate degree. It's a historically black college in my hometown where I grew up. And Haynes was at Savannah State from 1967 to 1992. When he moved from Savannah State, a small school y'all never heard of, and he went to the University of Michigan as a full professor in the political science department. And the poli-sci department, and I think Susan and others would agree, is perhaps the top political science department in the nation. And so my professor who taught me at this small black school ended up his career at Michigan. And so I learned about Diggs in his classes at Savannah State. Diggs would come up in many of the courses Professor Walton taught. Haynes taught a course on African politics. He came up in African politics. Haynes taught a course on Congress. He came up in founding the Congressional Black Caucus. Haynes taught a course on urban politics. D.C. came up because D.C. was an odd urban entity, if you will, because Congress controls it. So I learned about this man Diggs, when I was 18, 19 years old. And then I went to graduate school and I learned more still about his contributions. And I learned that no one had written a book on the dude. And a few years ago, I decided to take the plunge and to do it. As Eric said, this is research based largely on archival research. Diggs left his papers at Howard University at the Moreland Spring Research Center. I have his FBI files through the Freedom of Information Act, newspapers, lots of government documents. And I love this one. I went to all the libraries that he served under, from Eisenhower to Carter. And you go there and you ask for stuff on Diggs. And what's fascinating is how thick the file would be on Diggs. He was a prolific writer of letters, memoranda to presidents and U.S. cabinet members, frequently writing, expressing his concerns to the top people. And I went through the libraries and found those. I interviewed his family members, friends, Congress members, and then I have personal papers. I'm convinced the Diggs family understood that they were a significant family in Detroit. And so the family members gave me letters, I should say copies of letters, that Diggs wrote his mom and dad when he was in college. 17, 18 years old, you will not find those letters in the archives. They're in the personal papers of the family, and they allowed me to copy it. Okay, I just want to show you I went to, okay, I'm not lying, okay, I went to all the libraries, okay? I interviewed the members of Congress who he served with, and let me just add, these folk I interviewed who he served with, they welcomed me. Charlie Rangel, for example, when I interviewed him, I came into his office, the first thing Rangel said was, Professor Orr, I'm glad you're doing this. Charlie deserves it. His close friend was Judge Damon Keefe, a significant jurist in Michigan. There's the letters from Fisk University when he was a kid. He's writing about the racism. He grew up in Detroit. He goes to Fisk University and he discovers that he couldn't go in to certain places. He's writing mom and dad and telling them what's happening. There he's in the military. Watch my time, man, because I can go on, you better stop me. You better stop. Here's some significant life events. He's born in 1922 in Detroit. He's a child of the Great Migration. His mom and dad were from the South, and he was born in Detroit, okay? He went to Michigan. He didn't like it there. We can talk about that later. But he finished his degree in 1983 after Congress. All the things that Eric said that Diggs accomplished was accomplished by a man with a high school diploma, no college degree at all. His family owned something called the House of Diggs Funeral Home, hence the title of the book. House of Diggs Funeral Home was a major business enterprise in Detroit. If you were Black in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, you better believe the Diggs would bury your behind, okay? They control the Black funeral market from the 1940s until the late 1960s. He was married 4 times. Interesting family life, personal life, okay? 6 children. I interviewed all 6 children. Let me just say this, they're very pleased. They're very pleased that someone has captured the life and contribution of their dad, okay? He was convicted, censored in 1979. Interesting story behind the censure. There's a chapter in the book called Diggs Meets Newt. And that's Newt Gingrich. Newt Gingrich got his first national exposure attacking the convicted Diggs who had returned, who the voters reelected him, although he got convicted. So he goes to Congress in 1978, reelected, and so does Newt Gingrich. And Newt Gingrich began to attack the Democrats around Diggs and led to his censure and his resignation. He died. He spent 7 months in prison, and he would die in 1998. The funeral home was so popular, if Black people visited Detroit, they would go and take a tour of the funeral home. In my book, you'll see that Dr. King came to Detroit and he took a tour of the funeral home. And they would send back a postcard to their Black relatives. Say, hey, I was in Detroit and I went by the Diggs funeral home. Okay. His father was a significant civic political leader. That's Charlie Sr. and Charlie Jr. there. His father was parlayed the success of the funeral home into electoral politics. Okay, and ran for office in 1936, became the first Black Democratic state senator in Michigan, a major player in the alliance between Blacks and labor union. I'll go past this. Let me just say this, because I want to get to my colleagues. Diggs would win office in 1954, defeating a long-term incumbent, this liberal Democrat here named George O'Brien. At the time, he's the first Black person to win election in a majority white district. Okay? I'll skip this. Let's see. He goes, there's only 2 other Blacks in Congress. Dawson from Chicago, a very conservative Black Congress member. Adam Clayton Powell, the Black militant. You probably heard of him. Let's see, what else? Let's do this. He was at the Emmett Till trial, the only federal official at the trial. And when you read the memoirs and the interviews of the men and women who testified, the Black men and women who testified, and pointed a finger at those 2 white men who killed Emmett Till, they would tell you, and they told the reporters and their friends, that seeing Congressman Diggs, a Black man, in that courtroom gave them the courage to come forward in 1955 and point an accusing finger at 2 white men, which was a dangerous thing to do in 1955. So Diggs' presence there encouraged those Black men and women to come forward. Not only that, his presence brought additional media attention to the trial. He was a close friend with Dr. King. I have a chapter entitled Brothers in the Struggle. Okay, they were very, very close. In fact, the FBI, if you don't believe me, FBI, in the FBI file says Diggs is, quote, a close associate of Dr. King, unquote. I learned this. You go into the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, Congressman Diggs is in a permanent exhibit. Now, not many Black people in the Air and Space Museum, I guess tell you that, okay? You guess not, okay? But he's in there because he played a major role in the 1950s in desegregating commercial air travel before the 1964 Civil Rights Act. okay? Before the 1964 Civil Rights Act. He did similar work around discrimination in the military, especially off base. He was very concerned about the fact that the black troops could not stay and go various places. They couldn't bowl with their white colleagues. And so he focused a lot on what many people ignored, the impact of off-base discrimination and the impact it had on troop morale. A big committee came out of his investigation. I got to stop here, but he was a founder of the Congressional Black Caucus. Okay, the founder. I can talk about that later. There are 13 founding members. Their first big splash, they met with President Nixon, who refused to meet with them. He was at this big convention in Gary, Indiana in 1972. Home rule in Washington, D.C. For 100 years, the president appointed the mayor and top officials in Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia. It's a federal district. They didn't want black people to run the district and make it short, okay? As the population shift, they said, we're not going to let these black folk run this thing, okay? Diggs pushed through the first home rule bill after 100 years. And so Muriel Bowser can be attributed to Diggs. And finally, I'll leave you on this. He was a big champion for Africa. In fact, he was known in Congress as Mr. Africa. He led. Let me be very clear on this, because I think this is perhaps his biggest legacy. The American anti-apartheid movement literally started in the offices of Charles Diggs Jr. in the 1950s. We tend to think about it in the 1980s and 1990s. Diggs was talking about apartheid before most people knew what apartheid was about. And he used his position as chair of the Subcommittee on Africa to raise America's awareness about our relationship with this racist regime in South Africa. And when Mandela came out of prison and came to America, he pointed out that his release and the economic sanctions on South Africa could be attributed to the Congressional Black Caucus, which Diggs was the founder, and an organization called Trans-Africa, in which Diggs was the principal visionary of creating Trans-Africa, which became a major anti-apartheid organization. It's led by Randall Robinson, okay? And then finally, I'll stop here and tell you that the book says, Ramona told me I should bring something to wipe my face. She's going to say, why didn't you bring something to brush your face? That's what she's going to, first thing she's going to tell me when I talk to my wife later on. The book is called The Rise and Fall, and Diggs had a fall. He gave his secretary a raise, and the increased salary came back to him. That's why it's called a payroll kickback scheme. He got in deep financial problems because the house of Diggs crashed. His father committed suicide, and the business went belly up. And he had a hard time managing his money, and he was a gambler too. He gambled a lot. In fact, one of his friends said his gambling appeared to be like an addiction, okay? And then he had 6 kids, and that could be kind of expensive, you see, okay? And so he got in trouble, and he went to prison for 7 months. Someone called the FBI, or rather the Justice Department, and told them what Diggs had been doing. To this date, the government has not revealed the confidential informant who got on the phone and called the Justice Department and said, you know what? you ought to check out Diggs. He's doing something funny. And that's what happened. They went and they investigated and found he was doing this payroll kickback scheme. He had no good defense for it. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Good.
Oh, there's some seats here in the front if anyone needs one. Thank you.
Most accounts of the Congressional Black Caucus begin with its founding in 1971. It was founded near the end of the Black Civil Rights Movement, which scholars say was in 1972 when Nixon was reelected. Thank you. Books have been written how the CBC has advocated for the rights of Blacks and its role in pressuring government for racial equality. Marion Orr's book on Congressman Charles Diggs provides an early account of how Black members of Congress represented Blacks in government. Diggs was elected in 1955 and predates the start of the Civil Rights Movement by 2 years. The Civil Rights Movement started in 1957, some say. We don't know much about Diggs other than that, or the other Blacks who were the first in their state to be elected like Diggs. There's the exception of Adam Clayton Powell, who was elected in 1944. Marion Orr told me that there's a new book on Arthur Mitchell, who was elected to the Congress as a Black man in 1934 in Chicago. Until the mid-1940s, Mitchell had been the only Black representative in Congress since Reconstruction. So we see more books are being published on these pioneers in the Congress, Black pioneers. We don't know much about Diggs because he left Congress in disgrace. He was convicted in 1980 of mail fraud and sentenced to 3 years. But as Orr explains, Diggs worked on Black and African issues as a member of the U.S. House aggressively and systematically. Orr writes that Diggs was a freedom warrior, but the role of the Black congressman in the civil rights struggle is not well known. We don't really know how Black members of Congress participated in the civil rights struggle. Dawson, the other Black congressman, was conservative and did not make waves, while Powell was flamboyant and radical. And like I said, there's autobiographies of Powell that exist. He was the most famous representative of Black America of the three, Dawson, Diggs, Powell. Orr labels Diggs' approach as strategic moderation. Diggs was in the middle, and he would moderate his demands to appeal to the Democratic Party. His goal was to work with the political party to get his demands made. As a radical, Powell made requests that were outside of the party's goals, specifically through his Powell amendments. And this irked the political party, the Powell amendments. Diggs initially supported the Powell amendments while Dawson opposed them. Famously, the House is going to vote to expel Powell, and the U.S. Supreme Court is going to say that his expulsion was unconstitutional. Dawson did not speak out on race issues. He was part of the political machine. Black voters continued to reelect him because of the benefits they received from the machine. There wasn't the expectation that Diggs' approach would work. Southern Democrats controlled the party in the 50s and 60s. Civil rights legislation would ultimately pass in the 1960s through the heroic efforts of Blacks and the aggressive politics of President Johnson. But it would be much later in the 1990s when Black representation in Congress had increased dramatically and Blacks would be elevated to party and House leadership positions that Blacks would have more say over the party. So Diggs was before his time in terms of seeking to influence the Democratic Party. This would not really happen until the 1990s. The CBC had positioned itself as a radical group critical of the Democratic Party leadership. When President Carter was seeking re-election in the 1980s, some CBC members voiced support for Ted Kennedy's challenge. But today, when members of the squad, including Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, voted against Biden's infrastructure bill in protest, the CBC chair offered to moderate the conflict between the party and the squad. So the CBC is no longer positioned on the left of the Democratic Party, but more working in concordance with the Democratic Party. And it's changed from its radical roots of the past. Diggs would be leaving Congress by the time the CBC was, becoming more radical in 1980. And he probably would not have supported the movement to be radical. Like I said, he was a moderate, like Orr says, Diggs was a moderate. There was the movement to elect more blacks in the 1980s. This was seen in the 1984 presidential bid of Jesse Jackson in 1984 and then again in 1988. Orr writes that Diggs had opposed the Elect 3 campaign of 1960. Diggs's father, among others, had backed 2 black candidates in 2 House districts, but blacks were minorities in those districts. And so Diggs didn't think that they would win. And indeed, they did win in 1960 and 1962. He favored the integrationist approach of backing white liberal candidates. So in 1984, when Jackson ran, the CBC was divided and many backed Mondale over Jackson. But in 1988, when Jackson ran again, most of the CBC supported Jackson's presidential bid. Redistricting is going to change Congress. It's going to lead to 13 more blacks elected to the U.S. Congress in 1994, particularly from the South. Carol Moseley Braun is going to be elected to the U.S. Senate in 1992. It's likely that Diggs would have been eventually won over by the Black empowerment movement had he still been in office. He would have been like those initially skeptical of Jesse Jackson's presidential bid, but then probably by 1988 supporting it. He's representing Detroit after all. Diggs worked. I wanted to point out. I have too many notes, and I wanted to point out that Detroit, Michigan, does not have Black elected officials representing them in Congress and the House today. We've got Rashida Tlaib, who's representing Conyers' old district, and Shri Thanadar is representing Diggs' old district. Both are progressives, and I think that's significant because reading the book, Diggs was mostly a moderate, and so he would not have. He would have been more for staying loyal to the Democratic Party. He would not have supported, trying to leverage a vote on Biden's infrastructure bill, for example, like the squad members did. So Diggs worked aggressively for civil rights, though. He supported Martin Luther King and fought to end discrimination in the military. He fought to end Jim Crow in southern airports. History remembers Adam Clayton Powell's efforts on civil rights. And so this Orr's book is really an important contribution to the history here because Diggs was really truly overlooked. He was he was very successful in his endeavors to fight discrimination in U.S. society. He got D.C. Home Rule, which was quite a feat. Everyone understood D.C. Home Rule would empower blacks. Diggs got President Johnson to support his effort to get the airlines to hire black stewardesses. He demanded that the U.S. restrict its movement, its involvement with the white-led African nations early before the anti-apartheid movement of the 1980s. Diggs helped start Trans-Africa, a lobbying group aimed at improving U.S.-African relations. The book's description of Diggs' downfall was riveting. Orr was able to piece together that Randall Robinson had informed on Diggs. Randall Robinson passed away, so he was unable to get comments from Randall Robinson in terms of what he was thinking at the time when he did this. And Randall Robinson is an important figure, has written on, has several books as well on reparations and other things. Diggs had, as Marion explained, had put a sister-in-law on the payroll for a no-show job. This was among other things. Basically, most people remember Diggs only as a corrupt politician, but his role in the civil rights movement as a catalyst to the Black empowerment movement wouldn't be apparent without Orr's careful research in this book. And so it was really a joy to read the book. The book is a page turner. I think when we look at where would Diggs be today, I think, like I said, he would be pulled into the empowerment phase of the Black Power movement that we saw in the 1980s and early 1990s. But I think he would be typical of a moderate Black legislator today. He's not a John Conyers in terms of his politics. John Conyers had introduced a resolution to impeach George Bush. He was for a single-payer healthcare system. And so I think Diggs' legacy is important because he was working in a really low point in American history and made a contribution. But I think today he would not really stand out. And so I temper my enthusiasm for Charles Diggs with that.
Thank you. Dr. Scott, next.
Good job. Thank you.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. I am grateful for being invited to be a part of this panel today. I want to especially thank Dr. Orr for writing this book. When I went to Howard University, he contacted me and told me he was writing this book, and he was grateful that Diggs had donated his papers to Howard University Moreland Spingard. And that was, I guess, the bulk of much of the documents that when he first got started was found there at Howard University. And so I was aware of Congressman Diggs for several reasons. One, I'm a political scientist, and I went to Atlanta University, which was predominantly Black, one of the two predominantly Black universities that have a PhD program in political science. But I got a chance to meet Mr. Diggs on a couple of occasions because I was at the Gary Convention in 1972. I had just gone to Washington, D.C., had finished my master's degree, and had went to teach at Federal City College, which became UDC, which Diggs is responsible for the incorporation of the University of District of Columbia, because it was 3 different universities. And we were it was the most radical place I'd ever been. So I left Iowa and went there, and I got a chance to be a delegate there. And we were more younger people. We were more supportive of Amiri Baraka, Jesse Jackson, Diggs, and the people from Detroit. They were there. They were moderates. And in fact, the Michigan delegation walked out when we were trying to get this Black agenda adopted. And they didn't think we should come out with a Black agenda. So we didn't really support Diggs at that point. And then after the Gary Convention, as Dr. Orr covers in his book, is that Diggs was not as engaged. The Black Caucus was not as engaged because they felt like the convention had been taken over by Amiri Baraka and the Black nationalists. And somewhat Jesse Jackson, because Jesse Jackson was not at the top of the Black radicals. And so after that, you had the Black Caucus did not stay involved with the organizations that descended from the Black convention in Gary. And I also had a chance to meet Mr. Diggs when after I came to Federal City College, and Mr. Diggs was leading the African Liberation Day. We had the first National African Liberation Day in the country, and Mr. Diggs was the chair of that, and I worked on the local committee. And so I got a chance to meet him through Dr. May King, who was the only Black staff person at the American Political Science Association. And she was helping him put this National African Liberation Day together. And so from that side, he was known as more of a radical because he was pushing for disinvestment in South Africa. And I'm glad that Dr. Orr has been able to bring that out because I think later Diggs got lost in terms of some of his contributions to the freedom of South Africa because Randall Robinson, once she created Trans-Africa, they got a lot of the credit. So I'm happy that you are given the credit. Also, and then leaving there, going and working as the president of Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. The Congressional Black Caucus Foundation was founded by the Congressional Black Caucus, but we would do more of the charity nonprofit. We were a nonprofit organization that was born out of the CBC, and we gave scholarships and fellowships and internships to students. So that was much of our work. But by the time I came there, it was well after Mr. Diggs had left Congress and was no longer there. But, we did a lot to try to preserve the history of the Congressional Black Caucus. And one of the things that we did learn, which Dr. Orr brings out in his book, that Mr. Diggs is responsible for the CBC. Adam Clayton Powell wasn't interested in a Congressional Black Caucus. He liked being a lone wolf. He liked all of the limelight. And Dawson was way right for a Black person, I guess. So Dawson was more of, I guess in Chicago, you had Black people were put up by the machine. And so Dawson came there to represent the machine politics in Chicago. So he was not interested in starting a Black caucus. But it took people coming in like Congressman Clay from Missouri, Congressman Stoke from Cleveland, Shirley Chisholm from New York, John Conyers from Detroit. It took them coming to Washington to really support this idea that Mr. Diggs was floating. And I was really pleased that you mentioned in your book about the role of Mr. Johnson, the founder of Albany Magazine, played in reaching out to Diggs and pushing him on moving forward with creating a Congressional Black Caucus. I did not realize that until I read it in your book. So I know we don't have much time. So if Diggs had not been convicted, you ask what role would he have played beyond that? I'm sure he would have still continued to play a role around Africa. Being a resident of the District of Columbia, I would have been happy to have him around even now because we were taken over. I mean, he got us home rule. He helped us get home rule. And but now, they're talking about taking home rule, and we've been fighting for statehood. And so we won't We won't get that not doing this administration. And I don't know whether we'd get it, well, we will ever get it as long as, well, the city is no longer predominantly Black. People used to say that once the city was no longer predominantly Black, we would get home rule. We would get statehood. But that's not true because, if you notice when they took over the city and the present president of the United States said that that the people out there demonstrating were not residents, that's because he saw all these white people out. Those are my neighbors. And D.C. is no longer a chocolate city, but he didn't realize that. And maybe if he had realized that, maybe he wouldn't have moved to take over so fast. Okay, so let me just wrap up. Okay, how does the Black Caucus differ from the Diggs era? It differs a whole lot. One, there was only one Black woman in the original CBC, Shirley Chisholm. And I don't know whether you mentioned this in the book, that Diggs did not support her presidency. None of the guys.
Yeah, I do address this. He, in fact, did support her, and she came out for her in the Michigan primary. He had a press conference with Betty Shabazz, and the two of them stood there after the Gary Convention, and he endorsed.
Okay, I should have said before the Gary Convention, because there was nobody there to support letting her have a speech at the Gary Convention. So you have many more women in the caucus. The caucus is now 62 strong, and many of the people in the caucus now, like Mr. Diggs when he first came into Congress, represent majority districts, not majority Black districts. Even Maxine Waters' district is not majority Black anymore, but she's continued to be elected. We have more Southern Congress people than we did when Diggs was there. And also because a lot of the Democrats, the Black Democrats, have moved up in terms of seniority. And you know that power in Congress is based on seniority. So they remain very loyal to the Democratic Party because in that way they can have power. You see, the minority leader is Hakeem Jeffries, who's a Black man. But a lot of people are now criticizing him, saying he's more of a Democrat than he is a Black caucus.
Thank you. Thank you. And Dr. Larson.
Thank you. First of all, this book is amazing, and I hope you all get it and read it. And as I'm not a political scientist or a theorist. I'm a biographer, mostly of women. But this book was so incredible because there were certain themes that make this story so relevant. And the first things are, it is about family, right? Diggs has a lineage and parents and a family and a community that helped raise him and create the man that he became, this really powerful politician who obviously learned somewhere in his family, in the community, how to negotiate and make a way, sometimes out of no way. And so I found the way you wove that part of the story so that we get to know Diggs as a human being and place him in a time in our American history that is really complicated and not so attractive. And so the work I did on Fannie Lou Hamer, who is a civil rights activist from Mississippi, a Mississippi sharecropper, grew up in horrific circumstances. There were lynchings everywhere and killing Black people with no consequences, poverty, incredible poverty. So I learned about this world of people moving out after the Great Migration. Diggs's family is from Mississippi. Fannie Lou Hamer's family is from Mississippi. Hamer's family did not leave, but Diggs' family did. And they went to the North and created a completely new environment in the North with more power than Black people in the Deep South, who had basically no power. So when you write about Diggs being elected in 1954 to Congress, which is remarkable. And I know there were folks in Mississippi that were cheering when that happened. They had no Black representation. I think 5% of the Black population in Mississippi could vote in the 1950s. They were denied the right to vote. And within a year of his election, and within a few months of him taking office, he went to Mississippi. And every year there was a man by the name of Dr. T.M. Howard, who was a powerful Black man. He was a doctor, insurance salesman, business owner, and he would have these huge, I'm going to call it a convention, but thousands of African Americans would go to Mound Bayou, Mississippi in late April into early May. And they would talk and they would have music and they would have important leaders from around the country go and talk to the crowds there. Thurgood Marshall went in 1955, and other leading Black activists and actors from around the country outside of the South would go, and they would talk, and then they would have secret meetings. Fannie Lou Hamer was part of these secret meetings because they had to sort of be careful. In Mississippi, there were white supremacists just waiting for somebody to do something so they could go in and kill somebody. So he was there, and that really surprised me. There were not that many politicians, particularly Black politicians or people from away from Mississippi, who would go there and sort of stand up and try to confront what these supremacists were doing, but also to offer pathways to living a fuller life, trying to change Mississippi. And he did that. It was so surprising to me. He was such a, he was willing to go where other people were not willing to go. And within a few months of this Mound Bayou event, Emmett Till was murdered and killed in Drew, Mississippi, which was just a few miles from where Fannie Lou Hamer lived in Ruleville, Mississippi. And when I read that Diggs went down to the trial of the two white guys that killed Emmett Till, I was stunned because so many local African American leaders would not go, did not go, they didn't dare, but he did. And as you mentioned in your introductory talk, that inspired some of the witnesses that got up and spoke. Of course, the jury went out like 20 minutes or something, and they found the white guys innocent, who ended up admitting that they killed Emmett Till, but it didn't matter. They were white people, and they could get away with that in Mississippi. But there was something about Diggs that really made him different, I think, from a lot of the Black politicians in local communities or state offices, and then through the late 50s and into the 60s, where more African Americans were being elected into Congress. And I know some people complained that he was a moderate. Powell was a more of a radical, although I sort of have to laugh because when I did my work on Fannie Lou Hamer, those young students of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, these students that went to Mississippi in the summer of 64, and they battled the white supremacists. They stood up, they opened schools, they defied the laws down there. And Powell was he was very powerful civil rights activist, but he was an elitist. And he didn't have patience for people who were not well educated, like a Fannie Lou Hamer, who had a 6th grade education. But she's out there putting her life at risk, demanding that in Mississippi, they have equal rights, that they have schools just like white people have. She's out there doing that. Powell was embarrassed by her because her clothing, she didn't have enough money to buy nice clothing. She talked with a very thick Mississippi accent. When she was on the national stage in 1964 in Atlantic City at the Democratic National Convention, where the delegates were supposed to choose Lyndon Johnson to be the candidate for the presidency that fall, Powell was irritated because Fannie Lou Hamer had been invited to speak at the convention to challenge the seating of Mississippi's all-white Democratic delegation. She and her colleagues from Mississippi put their lives on the line to go up to Atlantic City and in front of the nation and the racists back in Mississippi to demand that they have representation. They weren't allowed to vote, and they demanded that the Democratic Party recognize their place and that they should be at the convention to help choose who might be the nominee for the Democratic Party in November. And her speech to the nation was powerful. It changed the world. Diggs played a role in that. Adam Clayton Powell disliked Fannie Lou Hamer. He told her to step down, to step away, that it wasn't her place. So there is a thing about women in this period. There are men that are very powerful, black and white men, and they discount the value and the importance of women. And Fannie Lou Hamer was one of them. But when I read more about what you wrote about what Diggs did during that Democratic convention, he went behind the scenes because it was a stalemate and it was getting ugly and it was getting dangerous. And Johnson was in a panic because he needed to be nominated to be elected president because he wanted to pass more civil rights legislation. But Fannie Lou Hamer and her colleagues were pissed because they wanted Johnson to do more, to be better, to be more powerful, and show and stand up for them. He wasn't ready to do that, and Diggs understood that. And the way you write that he went behind the scenes and he negotiated a deal with the other male black leaders in Mississippi who said, okay, we'll go with what you're saying, Congressman Diggs. And they settled what was happening in Mississippi. And the white delegation was seated. They ended up not voting. They were so ticked off. They went off and they became Republicans. But Fannie Lou Hamer was deeply hurt, but she had her moment there. And Diggs, when I read what you wrote, I realized that he basically kind of saved her reputation because he made sure that it wasn't messy. And I really admired your craft in showing what an amazing negotiator, and people call him moderate, but he was a moderator. He moderated between the more radical Powell and other people that were much more conservative, and he stood in the middle. He made things happen. And it's sort of a lesson. I know today people are concerned about, well, where are our Democratic representatives, black and white? And I'm hoping they're trying to negotiate behind the scenes like Diggs did for the country back in the 1960s. Thank you. It's a great book.
Thank you. So thank you. We have a little time for some questions. There's some mics that are going to be circulated, so please raise your hand and welcome your questions. Yeah. Thank you.
I got two questions kind of tied in. Professor Catherine Tate brought up the issue with Robinson and the FBI. And I just want to see, Professor Orr, what did you read from that, from FBI? And another thing, what was the lesson learned that you didn't know about Diggs, that took you back, that took your breath away, that made you say, oh, this is the guy?
Yeah. Thank you for the questions. Professor Tate alluded to it, and I lay it out pretty clearly in the book. In 1976, Congressman Diggs hired Randall Robinson, who was a Harvard-trained lawyer who had a very, very high level of interest and activity in Africa, on Africa issues. Diggs hired Robinson to be his chief of staff. However, he hired him purposely to be the person to organize what became Trans-Africa. In the 1950s, Diggs was talking about a Black American-led organization that could lobby on behalf of Africa the same way Jewish Americans on behalf of Israel. So he had this vision of what would become Trans-Africa going way back in the 1950s. He hired Randall Robinson to come into his office to build this Trans-Africa organization. And what happened was that Randall Robinson went through Mr. Diggs' files and discovered this payroll kickback scheme that I told you about. And Randall Robinson anonymously picked up the phone and called the U.S. Justice Department and told them, here's the tip, but you can't tell anybody that I told you. Congressman Diggs is involved or was involved in a payroll kickback scheme. And 3 months later, the FBI shows up in Diggs' office and he gets indicted. He goes to trial. 11 blacks, 1 white person in Washington, D.C., the trial. 11 blacks, 1 white, I think majority black women. And they convicted Diggs on all 29 counts of mail fraud dealing with the payroll kickback scheme. That was in October 78. Diggs got reelected in November of 1978 by his voters. And, the Detroit the district Democratic, and he got reelected. That brought on Gingrich, who would lead the charge, because Gingrich got elected in November 78 also, and Gingrich took it upon himself to publicize the Diggs thing. What did I learn that blew me away? I have to say it must have been the Randall Robinson finding that was in the FBI files. There was much speculation among family members and friends about how did the FBI learn about the payroll kickback scheme, and no one really knew. Some thought maybe a girlfriend may have, tipped him off, but Diggs had lots of girlfriends, I should say. But that wasn't the case. When I got the FBI file, I discovered the name is redacted. When you get an FBI file, there's some redactions, but the name's redacted, but everything else lined up with Randall Robinson, who, by the way, would not talk to me. I tried really hard to get him to talk to me. I communicated with him, and he would not agree to an interview. He said he would do an email interview. Send him email questions, but I never got a response. He did send me a statement that I could use for the book, he said. And the statement simply said he enjoyed working for Diggs, and Diggs was a great guy, this kind of thing. So yeah, that's what probably the big surprise that for me, for the most part, was the revelation that's in the book now that Diggs' protege was the person who fingered him.
More questions? Over here? Nope. And then here. Yeah.
Oh, okay, good. Fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. I can't wait to read the book. I'm fascinated by the fact that we have these categories of conservative, moderate, progressive, and it feels in a lot of cases like some of those categories don't capture the nuances and the context and the spaces in which people navigate in the real world. And so I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about that sort of categorization of Diggs, given that he's pushing agendas in certain places in certain ways that might be considered radical and other places not.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I'm very careful in the book in describing what I mean by the politics of strategic moderation. You got to remember that Diggs is operating in a period of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s for the most part. And there was a real question during this period of what direction black politics to go. There were some people like Amira Baraka who was pushing for African Americans to start a third party, a black-led political party. Okay? So my view of Diggs in terms of his politics of strategic moderation is that he is a moderate in terms of his approach to building a broad-based coalition of people who could support black civil rights and support his efforts around Africa. Hence, he's willing and able to work with men like William Bill Dawson from Chicago, the more conservative one. He has the capacity. He has the capacity to work with Adam Clayton Powell, and they were very good friends, quite frankly, and Amira Baraka, who Diggs worked with at the Black Gary Convention. So if you read the book, you see I'm very, very careful in terms of my characterization of Diggs' politics of strategic moderation. He was, and I quote a Black nationalist in saying this, Diggs was a race man to his heart, a race man. But he understood very clearly the function of the Democratic Party and the function of Congress. Two institutional structure where you have a lot of majority rule play a big role in this. And so he saw it as a effort to join the Democratic Party because it was the dominant party for some 50 years, if you will, in Congress, in order to push civil rights and to push his policy around Africa policy. So he was a martyr in the sense of his approach during this particular era when you're trying to build a broad-based coalition that's going to bring people across political spectrums to push civil rights and African policy. Yeah.
A question there?
Congratulations, Marion, on the book. And as my colleague in urban studies, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more, maybe deepening what you just said about the role of Detroit in the founding of his politics of strategic moderation.
Yeah.
And also the role, and I was thinking maybe this had something to do with his relationship with the labor movement in Detroit, some of the other aspects of Detroit politics that he brings with him to the national stage.
Yeah, and it's really, you're right. It's Diggs' Detroit upbringing and the role of his father in particular. Let me see if I can find his father here. 1 second, guys. I think we're coming up here. Here it is. Yes. Diggs Sr. was in the 30s and 40s, Sandy, the leading Black advocating that African Americans should join the labor movement. Let me remind you that Blacks were very skeptical in the 20s and 30s of the labor movement, especially the industrial labor movement. So Diggs watched his father in Detroit, in Michigan, build power and coalitions with liberal whites, labor union activists, and others in Detroit. And he comes out of, his politics is linked to this liberal Black labor coalition. And he learns how to operate within this sort of coalition atmosphere, especially as a member of a racial minority. Because in Detroit and in Michigan, African Americans during this period were a racial minority. And so Diggs understood that and began to watch his father build and work with folk to build these various coalitions. I think it has a lot to do with the time frame in which he came up as a young person watching his father work within this Black labor liberal coalition. Yeah.
Professor Orr, in your book, is there any mention of Congressperson Diggs' relationship with C.L. Franklin, Aretha's father, and Albert Cleage, who had the Church of the Black Madonna in Detroit, Michigan?
Yes. Albert Cleage was the leading Black nationalist in Detroit in the 1950s and 60s. He was the leading Black nationalist, and he was a strong supporter of Diggs. In fact, he's the person who I said earlier quoted as saying, Diggs is a race man. Diggs was very closely aligned with Aretha Franklin's father, the Reverend C.L. Franklin. In 1963, Dr. King and the SCLC resources were depleting, and they needed to raise money after the Birmingham movement. King came to Detroit to raise money because he knew that Diggs and the Reverend C.L. Franklin in particular were good at fundraising. And so they held this March for Freedom in August of 1963, where Diggs introduced Dr. King to a crowd of some 125,000 people. At the time, it was the largest civil rights demonstration before the March on Washington. And it was at that Detroit speech that Dr. King made his first I Have a Dream speech. It becomes famous in the March on Washington, but he actually made the I Have a Dream speech in Detroit some months prior to the March on Washington. So he had a close relationship with leaders like C.L. Franklin in Detroit. C.L. Franklin's church was in the 13th Congressional District where Diggs represented. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, Professor Orr. My name is Natalia. I actually was in one of your courses here at Brown during my undergraduate years. I'm now in the MPA program. And first, congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about how your positionality has informed you when it comes to the writing of the book. Did you try to stay neutral? Did you take a side? And if you could speak a little bit about decisions that you make and how it made in how you approach
really
that.
good question. As a biographer, you have a tendency to be drawn into into the person you're writing about. I believe I was very, very careful in providing a very balanced view of Charlie Diggs. There are some things in here I can tell you that the family members wish I had not included. So you raise a really good question. I think if you read the book, and when you read the book, you'll see that I really tried to be fair. For example, I take no position on Randall Robinson calling the FBI and telling anonymously what happened to Charlie Diggs. I may have a view, but you know what? I want the reader to read the book and say, okay, how do you size up what Randall Robinson did in this regard? I can't really help you with that because he refused to talk to me. I could speculate, but I don't go there. So I leave it to you all to say, okay, here's this young man who, how do you size this up? So you really raise a good question, and biographers have to be very careful with that. And I say very front up in the book that as a true biography, I'm going to lay it all out there, and I lay the good and I lay the bad. And what I think is what's very fascinating, quite frankly, is that when people read the book, they come away impressed with the good. Many of them had heard the bad, the downfall. Absolutely. But when folk read the book, they come away saying, my goodness, I had no idea this guy accomplished so much. So, and that's part of what I want to do. I want a balanced, fuller understanding of this human being, this man. All of us have frailties and weaknesses and shortcomings, but that should not neglect or overrule the other great things that this guy did. And I try to lay that out in the book and try to be very careful and balanced about it.
So this has been an incredibly rich conversation, which could continue a long time, but we have to stop there. So there's time for Professor Orr to sign some books, maybe some conversation continue over that. This is an incredibly riveting book, really well written. It's a great read, so I encourage everyone to buy it. And thank you so much to the panel.